welcome Christos. It's like a chat between three friends right now. Honestly, like every single episode of the podcast that we have, it's like chat with friends. I love this.
Love it.
Yeah.
Love it.
This is my
Yeah.
favorite podcast format.
It's like when you get in a room with somebody and it's the first time you maybe met them or you've, had a brief interaction before, but then you really get to kind of dive into some good conversation. So I was excited to have you here, Christos. I think you heard one of our previous episodes and we wanted to get you on the show and hear about your career, hear about your time at Microsoft and kind of what you're working on today and what you're excited about. What's getting you excited right now in your job?
You guys are getting me excited. There you go. Being here.
That's fantastic.
With you.
Yeah, please don't stay in the corner of the party. Please come hang out with us. Ask us questions. That's what this is all about.
Don't encourage me.
Yeah.
Careful.
Right.
Careful what
No,
you
that's
ask for.
okay. Because we love when people talk more about their stuff. Because again, our listeners, they love to learn about different career paths. They like to learn about what roadblocks and challenges you had to kind of go through to get where you are today. So I'll stop talking. Christos, mic is yours. Tell us more about yourself.
Okay, maybe we start with what I'm doing right now, and then we do a retrospect of
Totally great.
where I
Sounds like a good plan.
because I think it makes sense, right? How did we get here? So right now I work as a program manager, developer advocate for the Microsoft Identity division. Me and my partner in crime, JP, are responsible for the developer story of Microsoft Identity. So anytime they have to authenticate users in your app, every time you have to implement something like CI/CD or remove secrets from your applications, there's all these facades that we have to, we try to educate developers about how to write more secure software, as secure as possible, obviously, but eliminating certain things like we don't want people to write their own authentication providers, right? If we can eliminate all that danger and let people carry on with their tasks, then my job is done. So right now, I'm fairly new to the team. The team is fairly new as well. So we joined back in March, both me and JP, with a few days difference, and we'll be building the team slowly to be what it is today. And it's really exciting because I get up every morning and I get to do the things I love and I'm passionate about. So it's more than a job, it's a hobby. Just don't tell my manager because he's actually paying me for this, which I don't think is good. But finding that sweet spot in your career is fantastic. So with that, I want to take a little bit of a journey back to how I got to be where I am to be today, and explain how it started. So for people that haven't followed me in my career or they haven't seen what I've done, I started fairly late in IT. I was a very late bloomer. I didn't grow around PCs, although I was always fascinated by PCs. And at some point in my career path, I actually did a lot of classical studies at school. And the dream was actually to become an interpreter in the European Union because I come from Europe and I knew well two languages or well enough to be an interpreter. But when I looked at the studying and getting that, I found that the circle was becoming very small. And I also had the foresight to think that computers will be intelligent enough one day to replace humans in that space. So today you can actually pass a text or live speech and get real-time translation in multiple languages. In fact, Skype that we're using right now can do that for you. So it's fascinating that I was going to study something that would be eliminated, and I was like, no, maybe I should rethink. And at that point in my career, I was 21, and I said to myself, what do I really like to do? Like, if I could choose right now, what would I do? And it dawned on me, I want to be a hacker. That was the plan. I want to hack. I would be a white hacker, not a black hat hacker, right? One of the good guys protecting systems. So I was like, okay, why do I need to do that? I need to obviously know how to write code. So let's go and get a degree in software engineering. So I went and studied software engineering for 3 years. And then I was like, you know what? I need to know about networks. So how about if I do a master's degree in networking? So I went and did a master's degree in networking. So Cisco, routers, switches, VPNs, firewalls, all the shebang, certified in Cisco. And I was like, you know what? I like writing software more than actually playing with networks. And it seems too centralized as well. Like if you are working for a big company today, and in the last 20 years actually, most of the hardware is managed centrally from one central location. You can reboot stuff, you can control and push patches out. So there was not a lot of career advancement and development in that space. It also almost felt quite small. Whereas software, you can do anything, like so many languages, so many different tools, and we always need software. So we went back into writing software. My first job was a scary one, where I joined a manufacturing company that print labels for all the wine bottles and whiskeys that you see out there. They actually had about 80% of the global market in one small place somewhere in Glasgow. So my first job was to rewrite all their software from Access, yes, that's right, MS Access, into VB.NET. I don't know if that choice was good or not, but
How much VBA was there?
There was a lot of VBA there, and there
I would
were a lot of
imagine.
issues. Oh yeah, it was technically copying the VBA into VB.NET, right? Which made so much sense.
And how big was the software team that you were coming into? I don't imagine it was super big or robust, or was it small? Or
back then, it was there were two people before I joined the team, the main software guy and the sales guy that picked up software as he was going. So they had one main person writing most of the software, and then they said, hey, who here on the floor likes to write software or wants to write software? So they taught the other guy how to write software. And then the first guy obviously found a better gig, so he left. So the main programmer, the main guy that knew how to write code, left. And I joined the team to help support my other friend, David. We became friends. We worked together side by side for a year, but he was not development was not his core skill. And although that's not bad, because the people I work day in, day out these days, most of them don't really have a heavy software engineering degree. Some of them come from music degrees or science or maths, right? You don't have to be, you don't have to have studied software engineering. However, when you join a very small team with not a lot of experience, a lot of bad practices start happening. So just to give you some examples, I mean, I actually gave a talk on that at NDC one day about all the mistakes I've done in my career, and then 90% were in that job. So we were writing code in production. There was no dev or QA environment. We were pointing to the live database. Hence, one day I wiped out 15,000 records from our invoicing system. Yeah,
wow.
and then the backups were all in some random files. We did not have a solid backup scenario. So restoring a backup file, I was like, hey, David, when was the last time that we actually took a copy of that database? I was like, I did one yesterday. I was like, yeah,
it was before DevOps and before all these good practices.
That was 2005, so it wasn't too far back. No, I'm not ancient, right?
Right. So, deploy.
Yeah,
but we're not going to get into that. But
there were tools, yes.
The deploy essentially was copied on an FTP share. That's your deploy.
It wasn't even that. It was actually sticking into a USB file and then running around the floor. And there was a large floor. It's a manufacturing company, so every single PC that was on the floor had to be updated with the same piece of software. And I would run around, and imagine I would spend 2 hours a day doing that. And then by the time I would go back to the office, the dev office, I would get a phone call saying, hey, something is broken. And that was my daily cycle. To the point I got so fed up deploying that, I said, you know what, let's rewrite everything in web. And I convinced my boss at the time to send me and learn some Cold Fusion. So many bad choices back then. Cold Fusion was all the rage. So we rewrote most of the software in my 1 year there in Cold Fusion because I could not be bothered pushing software with USB sticks. I was like, I'll stick in one central server, and then everybody can access.
Like super heavyweight backend applications. Like Cold Fusion is so heavy.
Yes.
I remember trying it out and like, what was like 2007, 6?
Yeah.
And it was such a pain. Like one of the things that developers don't realize is how easy it is today with things like ASP.NET MVC, how much heavy lifting these frameworks do for you. Yes. That in the era of Cold Fusion, you had to write manually, and it was a pain.
It was, but it came with some funky add-ons. Like I remember creating charts on the fly by just dumping some data into an array, and it would create the charts for me. And my bosses were so impressed by that. And that was after 2 days of like an intense, almost like a boot camp of Cold Fusion for 2 days. And then I left with this giant handbook of the recipes of what kind of damage you can do. Now that was about 1.5 years. I learned some basics there. And we're doing everything because it was such a small shop. We're doing IT, we're doing DevOps, whatever kind of label you can put on that kind of DevOps. We're managing the networks, troubleshooting. So it was a great experience. That was my first job out of university. And then I was like, I'm ready to move on. So I was offered to go and work for a company in Edinburgh, which was about 50 minutes from Glasgow. And there I joined a company that was writing software for the securities finance industry, which is a very niche kind of a sub-market of the stock exchange. Not many people know the securities finance, but it is in effect, you own some stock and some people want that stock and you can lend that stock to other people while you still own it and you get some collateral back. And that company I worked for owned a very large percentage of the market because they started as a very niche. The guys that owned the company were London Stock Exchange experts, and they found that kind of a gap in the market. So they started getting all this data from, it was super data heavy. We were importing at the time, I remember, something like 2 billion rows per day. That was daily processing. And then we had all these random different processes back then to import all the data, sanitize the data. We had data analysts that were actually looking at the data. That was very different to the data analysts that we have today, but it was a very early days of data analysis where they would actually open the CSV files, analyze the data, look for discrepancies in the data. Like if you had a million, let's say you recorded a million transactions in one file that didn't make any sense when everything else was 10 transactions, then they would sanitize and validate the data. So that company was super fun to work with. I learned so much because they had some really competent developers working there. And that was my first time actually moving to the full .NET stack. So everything was .NET. ASP.NET early days, not even MVC. Most of that was web forms with some third-party controllers. In fact, we rolled out all our controls ourselves until we decided to buy some. And I stayed there for 6 years. I started as an IT admin, bringing all that experience from my previous job. And after a year and a half, I was like, you know what? I'm fed up with managing servers and networks. And we managed everything. There was no cloud back then for us. So we had our server stack inside another room with some fans blowing into it. Sometimes the extension leads would just catch fire because we had so much load going over the normal building that we were housed. I joined the software team and started writing software. It was so much fun, and we definitely enjoyed our time there. And at some point, I got fed up with going back and forth in Edinburgh. We had kids as well. So I was like, I don't want to be away from the kids for too long. So after 6 years, I took the plunge and decided to become a consultant. So I started up my own company. I think it's like a rite of passage. Everyone has to do that in their career. I started up a company, which was a one-person company. I was consulting myself, going from one contract to another. My biggest fear there at that point was, do I know enough to be considered an expert when I join a company to work as a consultant? So I would have done it probably sooner. And if I knew what I knew at the time that I joined, I would have probably jumped 3 years sooner. Because in effect, as a consultant, you jump into a project to help them quickly move into something, or you have to do some work that nobody else wants to do, the garage work that everybody hates. But you get paid a lot of money to do it, so you can't really complain about that. And you learn so much. So, spending 3 months or 6 months or a year from one project to another, you get different technologies, different kind of styles of development and teams, which was a lot of experience, right? If you work for one company, they have one way of doing things. And this could be great, but you don't know until you know. So, looking back, I was like, oh my God, I made so many mistakes in my career. But, I'm surprised that we didn't bring the house down in so many cases.
Right.
It's
the diversity of experience is super important. And I think this is where I think I'm with you on that point, where too often you hear about people getting kind of holed up in their way of thinking, the way of doing things, because that's how you've always been doing things. There's no other way.
Yep.
But then you get thrown in a completely different environment and you realize that, oh my God, all I was doing can be done so much differently, so much better, some for worse, but you learn. And that learning experience is so key for anyone's career that I can't overstate it enough how important it is.
And there are different ways to achieve that these days. You don't have to move from one job to another. Like if you join a big company like Microsoft or Amazon, you might not get exposed to different practices.
Right.
You can work in open source. You can work on other projects. You can pick up new things. You can read, study, go to conferences. So, working as a consultant was one way to achieve that back in 2012. And it helped a lot. In the end, I knew what to ask for when I went to an interview. Interviews became more for me as a clearing process of, do I really want to join this company? And do I have what they want me to have, like the right skills? you can learn one of the technologies that they might be asking. So let's say you're a .NET developer and say, well, you have some projects in Node. Fine, I can pick up Node because that interests me. But at the same time, they might say, welcome to our company. We're still using ASP Classic, and most of our stuff is written with PHP. You might like, oh, well, I don't want to do that. You also ask questions like, hey, what is your CI/CD pipeline? How often do you release software? What is the red tape? How much time am I going to be writing software over sitting in meetings? And once you start asking these questions, you find the right places to work for. And it became a lot more fun towards the end in my consulting career, where I would just jump into a call or go for an interview in person back in the good old days, where you actually turn up in the company and have this kind of a in-face conversation. And it was fun because I would have 2 or 3 offers at the same time. I'd be looking around and I would choose the right one for my career. And it was not always about money. Sometimes, like I worked in the banking industry, and oh my God, you would have to pay me billions of dollars. And sometimes I wouldn't even choose that because there was a lot of red tape. Like I for the 1 gig I ended up doing, first it was all tech. Both in software and hardware. The reason like Windows 7 was the cutting edge in 2014 when everybody had moved on to Windows 8 back then. I was like, and that was like they were trialing Windows 7 and everybody else was running on XP. The developers had like the cutting edge tech. It's like you're 10 years behind everybody else. And then we were writing WPF with really bad practices, and we couldn't upgrade to .NET over .NET 2 back then. It was like .NET 4.5 is has just been released, but we're stuck to old stack. Some people love that. In fact, I had a consultant that was working there. When I joined, he left, and then he did another gig and came back. I was like, why would you choose to come back here? Anyway, that was the first gig. In fact, I cut short. Like I had a year, and in 9 months, I was like, you know what, guys, I had enough, I think, of this one. I'm jumping ship. Yeah, go on.
I would be interested to know, like, you had this contrast of like, when you started your career, you joined a company where you had to be a jack of all trades and kind of use your full skill set, and you were put under probably a lot of heat, right? Like you got to get things done, and the senior developer left, and like you said, there were some bad habits that came out of that, and then you went to a well-established, obviously more structured experience, picked up some great skills there, and you're like, you know what, I can do this on my own. What were some of the biggest takeaways from the time consulting, like, and challenges? So obviously you're running your own business too, right? You're a businessman, not just doing the technical work.
Takeaways from consulting, I think quite a few experiences. First, you need to very, very carefully scope what the job would look like. So as I said, the banking contract, I jumped into that without really spending too much time in the details. And in the end, I wasn't happy working there. If you don't get excited and inspired to go to the office every day, then you don't want to go. It doesn't work out for you. At least for me, if there's no learning experience on my day-to-day stuff, if I'm not doing things I enjoy, and you don't always get to do things that you enjoy, but if 80% of your time is spent on a call trying to convince the release team to actually add a NuGet package to the org so you can release your software that's been on hold for 3 months, then you can understand what kind of frustration that looks like. Actually finding that person in the company took me a month.
I know that my own time, like kind of breaking out and trying to do, design and web development on my own, it was a challenge to like kind of curate clients. That was like a whole different world that like I hadn't gained from my previous experiences. So that was like a real challenge, and it takes a lot of like invested time. Yes. Right. So to dig into the company you're going to go do some work for. And then sometimes those projects, like they have secret scope that you didn't realize, and it kind of blows up, and you're like, man, this client has been kind of a bigger pain than it was worth, honestly.
Yes. So I would say a couple of things. Networking is super important. Building a reliable network that can vouch for you, or they can, they can help you find your next gig is very important. And in the end, it ended up being like that, where I was well known at least in the Scottish community, to be called and say, companies would say, come and work for us. And it was funny because exactly like that on my last gig, somebody called me and said, come and work for us. We're a small company, but we do some really exciting things. I was like, I don't even know you guys. And how did you find me? It's like, well, somebody has recommended you, and we'd love you to come and work for us. And it wasn't even an interview. It was more a case of when do you want to start? and what would you like to do if you join the team? So that's a real privilege if you ever find yourself in that kind of a state. And it's weird me blowing my own trumpet, which
Well, and
It's your reputation, right?
Yeah.
It's
You
reputation,
build
yeah.
out your reputation where people know you get shit done.
Yeah.
And when people know that I mean, that opens a lot of doors.
Yes.
And if a client comes to you and they're already excited to work with you, usually it's a pretty good relationship. That is also an experience I had, which is like they came to me, like they were knocking on my door, like, "Hey, we want to work with you," and you're like, "Okay, great." And they're like a little bit more open to like flexibility and like schedule, and the whole scope of the project just seems to go a lot easier than you hunting them down and having to make a sales pitch.
Yes, and that team, by the way, was probably one of the best gigs I had in my professional career. It was a small team of like 10 developers, which were all contractors, so super highly skilled, super well versed into the technologies. Always fun to jump into new things. There was great understanding. It was the first time I saw actually agile working in the right way. There was a lot of cohesion with the team. We would hang out for lunch together. We would hang out together for coffees. There was this camaraderie with the team. So finding that team as well, it's also very rare in the software industry, and there were no big egos or whatever. Everybody was open to feedback. We had some of these practices I actually took and worked with customers while I was at Microsoft. Like took some of the best things I learned there, and I would take them to other companies when we're building teams to explain to them how things can work better in certain cases. So networking is very important. And the second biggest thing that really helped me in my career was community work, conferences, user groups, blogging, and open source. These were probably more important to me than everything else. So in about 2012, I saw a blog post from Scott Hanselman that it was about why you should blog or why you should be involved with the community. And at the time, I heard an interview on .NET Rocks, one of the podcasts, and one of the guys that was there was John something. I can't remember his name now. And he had a course about marketing yourself as a developer. So at that time, like very coincidentally, I read these two things and I got inspired in getting involved with the community. So silently, I started blogging about things I was learning. So started with a blog in 2012, which is still going strong today after 8 years. And then in 2014, I decided to jump into public speaking, which was a lot of fun. It was just when .NET Core was starting. And back then it wasn't even .NET Core. It was named K something, .NET K or whatever. So it was all the K commands. It was very early on. Everything was put together with string and tape. So my first ever talk was on introducing .NET Core, what would become .NET Core anyway, in late 2015, 14. And it was for a local .NET conference. And it was great. I got hooked. It obviously went awful because I had my Mac with me and I was going to demo the .NET solution running on a Mac. And I connected the Mac to a very old projector. And then the Mac just barfed out. So the Mac had a very high resolution. The projector could not really display that. And in the end, it just couldn't show anything. So I said to everyone, just gather around. Just come closer to the desk and I'll show you on my Mac how it works. And
the thing you will never say in 2020.
Yes. Yeah. It's scarily how you
6 feet apart.
Yep.
Everyone take the circle, stand around.
Or take turns, right?
Take turns,
anyway,
yeah.
Everybody just gathered around, and I had my very first talk. I was terrified. In fact, I had just put braces on as well at the age of 37 or whatever, or 35, and it was awful. I couldn't even speak. In fact, I called my dentist the day before. I was like, "Can we take the braces off because I'm actually speaking in front of how many people, and I have no idea what's going to happen." It's like, "It's okay, you'll be fine." So with braces on and with a Mac that wasn't working, I did my first ever public talk. And I was hooked. People would just come to me after my session, and they were like, "Yeah, that was amazing, man. How can we learn about more of these things?" And I barely knew enough to scrape through the session. Like I barely made the demos work, and I just had enough information to make it work. But I loved it, and then started working with open source, started writing more, started traveling around the world to go and speak to various gigs and stuff. So that led me to Microsoft. In fact, I made MVP. In January 2016. And even though I started maybe a couple of years ago Before that, I said I want to be an MVP, and everything I was doing was about becoming an MVP. It turns out that you can't work to become an MVP. You become an MVP because you do things that you love. So in the Microsoft space, if you are working with a certain tech, there are things that you can do, obviously, to be valued as an MVP. But if you actually work with the community and love what you do, then that's a lot more genuine rather than trying to do just the things that make you an MVP. So since I spent 2 years working in the community and writing and traveling and working with Microsoft. Like I brought Microsoft to the UK, to Glasgow, because like, guys, the furthest you can go up is Manchester, which apparently for English people sounds like the north. That's the north for English people, but the actual north is Scotland. So I was like, you know what? We need to make it through the border. We need you to get here. So I organized a one-day event for introducing ASP.NET Core. And I work with the Microsoft guys quite closely. Big shout out to Martin Beebe, who actually put me through for an MVP award. So 2016, January, I get an MVP award. And the goal for me was to work closer with these guys and organize a lot more things. But within 2 months, Microsoft came and said, how about you come and work for us? I was like, yeah, that's surely a joke. In fact, they reached out to me via LinkedIn. And I thought, you know what, someone's playing a prank on me. I'm pretty sure that's not genuine. So I went down to Reading, first time ever at the Microsoft office, walk in for my first ever interview at a very big corporation like that. And it was terrifying and exciting at the same time. I finished the interview. I thought I did okay after passing 2 telephone interviews, obviously. And I said to my manager to be, can I keep the lanyard? And then I took a picture outside the office. I don't know if I'll ever come back here. And then the guy...
So being an MVP, what was your interview experience like?
It didn't make any difference actually. Although they knew me as an MVP, so when they reached out to me, they knew I was working closely with Microsoft, and they reached out to me and said, "Well, how about you come and join us?" I don't think being an MVP is something that really puts you over the competition or ahead of the competition, to be honest. But being an MVP, you're probably and Microsoft UK was smaller, right? So it's not like the beast that we have in the US where 67,000 people work here. It was 5,000 people, and you're bound to have your name heard, especially if you participate in events that Microsoft also tends to hang around. So it became like I met one of their, back in the day, we had developer advocates in the UK. So not the CDAs that we have now. It was actually dev advocacy, and there was the manager. I met with the manager in one of the conferences. So we had a one-to-one chat, and he said to me, "We would love to have you join us, but you can't work from Glasgow. You have to move to Reading." And that was a big move. That was a 600-mile move. I was like, "Well, yeah, but I can't really, because my wife works in Glasgow. It would be very hard for her to uproot, and we just had kids, so it would be very hard for us to move in general." So I thought that my dream was cut there until Microsoft offered me a position as a premier field engineer. And that was like, take consulting from 3 months and cut it to 1 day. That was the experience. Being a PFE, that actually summarizes the whole experience. You go from one customer to another, and you have to deliver on very different things. So one day I could be doing .NET, the next day I could be doing Node, then the next day I could be doing cloud, the next day I could be doing VBA on some random system running on their environment. Sometimes we could be doing Azure migration, so take what you're running here and run it on Azure. And you had to learn. That was a constant learning. It was non-stop. The pace was insanely fast. But I love that. I love, because I was doing it for 3 months. I could actually cut it out into 1 day and learn and move on and learn and move on. So if you like that experience, if you ever wanted to work in an environment that is hectic as hell, then being a PFE is probably one of the best jobs out there. In fact, it was a fantastic job. You pick up so much experience, but it's so condensed, and you choose your own gig. So as a PFE, you were never told that you have to go somewhere. You'd be getting a call from a resource coordinator and say, "Hey, we have somebody that is looking to build X with X technology. Are you the right person?" And I was a developer PFE, so I could literally do anything with any language as long as it could run on one of the Microsoft ecosystems. So Dynamics, although we had Dynamics PFEs, I would never touch it, or SharePoint and SQL and what have you. It was so much fun being a PFE. The only reason why I stopped doing it at the time was the constant traveling. It was nonstop. I would leave the house on Monday morning and not come home until Friday afternoon. because in Scotland we didn't really have that many customers, and most of the customers we had centralized office in London. So I ended up going to London to speak to the same customers that were running, data centers or solutions for Scottish customers.
So were you going on site for most of
Yes.
these customers? Okay.
Yeah, it was. I mean, you could do some things over Skype, but imagine now trying to inspire 15 developers to move to .NET Core, or going in there and speaking about Visual Studio for 6 hours nonstop, like doing these demos over Skype. It wouldn't really work, or Teams, or whatever technology you want to use. Some things worked. Like I've done it, especially towards the end when I was getting ready to move to the US. I did it, but I have to say that being in the same room and getting the vibe from the people, like you could be saying something and people might be turning off. I remember I walked once, I was doing .NET Core, and I spent 2 hours in the CLI, right? I did not even open the Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. And one of the guys just got so fed up that he got up and said, like, what is this, 1985? Why are you showing us the command line when we could be using an ID? I was like, it's okay. We'll move to the ID soon. But getting this kind of vibe and experience and seeing people bored or whatever, it actually helps feed a lot with the experience. Plus, sometimes it was a really confidential stuff. Like I worked with the Electoral Commission when they were doing the Brexit stuff, so we had to prep the infrastructure for disaster recovery and go through all the scenarios. So trusted advisory, that I've been called into, hey, this customer is deploying 35 web apps from on-prem to the cloud tomorrow. They need somebody to handhold them. Can you please do it? So a lot of fun, but a lot of on-site, and that meant not a lot of family time for me.
Mm-hmm. Very high pace.
I feel like that is shifting though. So
you
see that, now, if before you kind of had to be there in person, you had to have conferences and show it. Nowadays, we're moving towards on-demand learning, where I will learn at my own pace. The content is getting so good that there's videos, and Microsoft is a good example, right? Microsoft Learn TV, Docs, everything is there, right? Like you don't necessarily kind of you're no longer constrained by location.
No. In fact, I've done more conferences in the last conferences, podcasts, and user groups in the last 3 months than the last 4 years, because it's so easy. I just have to come down to my office and open my PC and then connect to whatever software, Zoom, Skype, Teams, Google Hangouts, or whatever they use, and just deliver. The only challenge there is that people can be easily distracted where they're sitting in front of their PC watching something. Like I can easily open my email while I'm talking to you or you're talking, and then you lose that kind of a connection. So definitely a lot of more opportunities with the new reality of COVID. Definitely a major shift in how companies hire people and how they expect people to work. And there needs to be trust, right? You can't say, well, if you're not in front of your PC, I can't believe that you're working. And I had a contract once where I interviewed and I said, hey, do you allow remote work? And the guy looked at me and said, we expect our developers to be sitting on their desks. And I said, you do realize I could be watching 8 hours YouTube videos and you wouldn't even know what I'm doing, right? So I expect that you trust me to deliver what you asked me to deliver. There are deliverables in software. It's easy to measure. But anyway.
But if anything, the shift also shows you that you can expose your content to a global audience. Yes. That's another constraint that we completely remove, is the fact that if before I needed to be at a conference, right? Like I paid for an expensive ticket to be at Build or wherever, and now I can be somewhere in Vietnam, I can be in Australia, I can be in South Africa. I can just connect and I can see the exact same content as somebody from the United States or Canada can see for free. Or pay, even if you have a paid version, that it doesn't matter. But you get that global exposure that previously you can access communities that were out of reach, because not everyone from a developing country can afford to fly to the United States, to stay at a hotel, to get to a conference. But now with that content being online, anyone can learn. I can be in Antarctica for all I care about.
And I think there's that difference though between just learning and being there for the experience, and there's a element of serendipity when you actually are in person, right? Christos, I think you were mentioning this, like when you're in the room with 12 other developers, when you're doing the PFE role, like you pick up on body language, or you're in the right place at the right time, and like you can kind of act on that. Whereas like a digital only event, you kind of lose that element of serendipity and some of the cues that like traditionally you might be able to follow up on, like, oh, I want to chat with this person, right? That was maybe in the same session as me, that had a really good question, right? Like they brought something up that was awesome at the end, and like we can now talk about that and ruminate over it versus like, yeah, it's on demand all the time and you can get to it really easily. And maybe even you access it after the fact, but you don't have, like, I don't have Den in the same room. I wouldn't even know he
Right.
went to it, right? So
Well,
it's like
yeah.
kind of pushes you together, right? It forces you. It's a forcing function for meeting other people.
So two more things there. One is that being global and virtual also means that you get speakers that are a lot more diverse and from a lot of different countries. I don't have to fly to Singapore to go and do a session on .NET in 70 people. And in like maybe a year ago, that's what my team used to do. They would fly around the world and speak to developers about identity. And, you know, think about the time and the effort and the cost of doing that. Now, we have a Twitch stream every Monday and Friday. We reach out a lot more people. We've reached out a lot more people in the last 3 months that my team has ever reached throughout its history, right? Because we are there. And that's the other thing, like being able to get the right talent from all around the world. It's fantastic. As a speaker, I don't have to fly to Ukraine to speak to a conference. I can do it from the comfort of my room at 2 a.m. in the morning. Fine. It's 2 a.m. in the morning. It's a small price to pay, but I get to be
But
there.
at least you go to bed in your bed at your house,
Yes,
right?
exactly. You don't have to be in a hotel. Now, the other thing that I definitely miss from this experience is connecting with people, making friends and hanging out after the session and being in the speaker's room or being out with the crowd and chatting to people about what they build and see how excited they are about what they do, helping them out in real time. I think if we nail that in the virtual space, if we manage to create that kind of a hanging out after my session, like a virtual space where people communicate and make friendships, it's very important. Like I met some of my like fanboy, like I was fanboys. Like I met Scott Hanselman in multiple conferences where we cross paths. We're in the same speaker's room, for example, and I would go and speak to him, and I had lunch with him one day, right? Yeah, having that opportunity is now gone, but I think we're gonna get it back because there's appetite and thirst for that, and hopefully.
I think there's like some really awesome technologies out there right now that we could start diving into, which all three of us are familiar with, like VR platforms, right? And there's just like social spaces that can be created with VR. It's like, yeah, we were kind of thrust into this COVID era, but like I know Microsoft, for a matter of fact, is thinking about this. Like, how can we create digital spaces and virtual spaces that are enhanced by VR headsets and things like that? So I think we're going to see like a wave of that. It's going to be really cool. And you can augment those spaces. I mean, you can do so much more rich stuff that you couldn't do in a traditional physical space, right? Which could be really cool.
Well, and it's certainly an interesting challenge also from the perspective that I do agree with both of you that humans are social by their nature. Like it's how we evolved since, I don't know, like the Stone Ages, right? We're tribal. We need people. We need that social connection. And I don't think a Zoom meeting or a Skype meeting can ever replace that, right? There's a term for it, and I know I've experienced it myself, which is Zoom fatigue. You just have so many of these calls that it gets exhausting because this is not the same as actually meeting with someone in person, talking to them, shaking their hand, and then saying, hey, let's keep in touch. Let's have a call later for another lunch or whatever. And I also feel like things such as, virtual reality, like they're interesting, but sometimes it almost feels like a Band-Aid because it doesn't truly replace that kind of in-person connection, right? Like seeing somebody's avatar in virtual space doesn't replace me seeing Christos's and Courtney's face react to what I just said, or like, are they yawning or are they bored? It's just like, it's an avatar that's moving along.
You're still behind that computer interface that has access to the entire world at your fingertips, right? So like, it's really super easy to get distracted and like warped into a totally different focus mode, right? Like your email pops up or a notification comes up. Freaking, Windows decides to reboot for the 13th time that day because it needs a patch, right? Like, I don't know. But like, yeah, I totally agree there. There's a gap that can't be bridged, even with all our tech might.
But we're also adaptable. So humans are adaptable and we'll find a way.
True. You know what? It's better than nothing, right? That's the other thing.
I
would rather take something over nothing. And we proved in the last 6 months or 9 months now, I'm losing count. 8
It's
months.
been 5 years.
It's been 5
Christos,
years. It's
what are you
March,
talking about?
March day 185. We proved that we can work remotely, we can still be productive. People like I know companies that would never think about going remote, and then overnight they went because they had to, and just goes to prove that we're adaptable and we can persist.
We're fortunate to live in an era where technology exists. Like having the same problem that we have now in 1918 is not the same, right? Like when you're holed up in a house, you can't go to the grocery store. Like there's no, safe ways to go outside. All these things, like we're still in a better position than we could be. So
I mean, even 5 years ago or 7 years ago, if that had happened, we wouldn't be able to respond as well.
Right.
It's
so
just
yeah, no, for sure. And I know we spent, oh my gosh, 40 minutes talking about all these things. So love when time flies. But I want to get to a topic that, Christos, you're working on identity.
Yep.
And for our listeners, I think it would be massively beneficial if you actually kind of walked us through what does identity mean, right? And so we talked about your background, how you got here, and now you build identity tools. Because to me, when I hear identity, my first hunch is like, okay, well, so it's a login that I can go to my AAD, to my Azure portal or whatever. Tell us more.
Sure. So Microsoft Identity is a platform that allows developers and companies to do a few things, and we have so many facades in that space. But at the simplest form, if you are a developer, then it's a login, logout kind of process. Like, how do I manage my users and users' data without me having to think about too much? I don't want you to be an expert in OAuth 2 or OpenID Connect. Most developers want to check a checkbox, say I added login, and go to the next task. So our goal is to provide you with the right libraries and the right documentation, the right tools to integrate identity into your system and then move on to something else. We want you to be happy, and we want you to do it securely and not end up in Troy Hunt's Have I Been Pwned website with over 10 billion hacked accounts. In fact, Capcom got hacked the other day. I don't know if you saw that. If you ever played games, and you're an avid gamer, I think, Dan, but Dennis, sorry. The whole point there is that we don't want developers to screw up. And in fact, I wrote my own identity system back in 2007, just cringe about thinking about it. But if I go into a room and say, how many of you here wrote your own login, logout routines? Usually half the room just, raise their hand because they've done it. And I don't want you to do that. So that's the first thing. But there are also these other things, like every time you log into Teams or Office or Dynamics or whatever, we have that kind of identity. So single sign-on, improving the user's experience so they don't have to sign into 20 different systems if they're in an organizational account. From a consumer perspective, if you're Walmart or if you're a small company that needs to manage users, if you're writing a website for your cousin that wants to have a forum for his friends, then we also have an offering for this kind of a business to customer, like Azure AD B2C, where you just integrate authentication there. But these days, it's funny how we say Azure AD is neither Azure nor AD. There are so many things that run everywhere that need to access some backend system. So you have a web app that speaks to an API or a database. How do you secure access to these things without screwing up? And by screwing up, I'm not saying having unencrypted data somewhere, but or using HTTPS. But how do you configure that connection string into your code? How do you provide your API key to your code securely, and making sure that you're checking that into source control and getting hacked by that? So there's this kind of other feature there from Microsoft Identity that allows you to create secretless apps, where we use a cloud identity to allow you to authenticate to certain systems and connect to other databases and other APIs without you having to compromise the security of your application. And developers don't have to worry about managing secrets in their code. IT pros don't have to manage their, how are these secrets done. And we write code every day. We go into tweets every week, and we show people how to actually build this. In fact, at .NET Conf last week, when we announced .NET 5, we did a demo on secure DevOps, where we used the things that would. So if you're running on GitHub Actions and you're deploying to an environment, how can you ensure that your pipeline does not contain any secrets? So not just identity, it is Microsoft Identity, but we cover so many different things and want developers to create code that are confident that it's not going to be compromised in one way or another. And for enterprise to be confident that their developers don't own secrets. So many stories out there. I could spend another 2 hours just saying how people have screwed up or how companies got screwed up by bad practices. So it's a very interesting role to be, because we get to build anything with anything. We can build stuff that run on AWS with Lambda and still authenticate against Azure AD. We can build stuff that run on Google and authenticate against Azure AD B2C. In fact, I did a Firebase blog the other day where you can authenticate Firebase users using Azure AD as a backend. And that means that you can still use Firebase, but you have the security of Azure AD. And just for fun, I'll leave you with a fact here. At Azure AD, we do 30 billion authentications per day. That's an insane amount of authentications if you think about it. And you don't have to flinch. It can be 1 login per day. It can be 10 million logins per day in your app. You as a developer, you don't ever have to worry about scalability or security or performance. So that figure alone, I had to actually check with marketing and the product team to make sure that this is a number we can confidently talk about. And it is. It's reality, and it's scary when you think about it.
So I'm curious, as a developer, you talked about some of the benefits. And kind of to me, the biggest question is, why should I care? So say I am the one that I build a database. My database is in the cloud. It's encrypted. I use hashes, right? I don't keep plain text passwords. So I'm doing this security stuff, and it seems at a surface level that it's fairly straightforward, right? Like create a user account, create some, scopes for the user account, and have a hash for password verification.
Perfect.
I'm good. Why should I use, in this case, an identity platform instead of hand-rolling my own solution?
First and foremost, you're way ahead of everybody else when you understand the difference between encrypting and hashing. So I've been to many companies. In fact, there are companies out there that you can, they make the news. I'm not going to name names right now, but that they insist that encrypting a password is secure. So even most of the developers understanding what the difference is it's a major challenge for us. And most people don't get it right. Now, okay, let's say you got everything right. You got your hashing, you got your solution set up correctly, your data is encrypted, you roll your keys, awesome. How are you gonna add multi-factor authentication to your solution? If you ever had to do that, you need to use a few services. You need to have an email service, you need to have a text message service, you need to make sure that the system is not going to be compromised. Right. Let's say you roll that yourself, then you can do that. Absolutely fine. It will just take you a couple of weeks to implement, which is perfect. Now, how are you going to implement conditional access? How are you going to control who is logging from where? And how do you know if my friend Courtney is not logging in from Germany while he's also in Seattle, right? A centralized delegated authentication system has all this built in for you as a developer. So technically, from my perspective, especially if you're a .NET developer, it literally takes 4 lines of code to do all that and more. Then you have to think about scopes, then you have to think about permissions, then you have to think about roles. And let's say you got all of that right for your system. Now, you leave the company, and 2 years down the line, another developer joins and they say, hey, we need to create another website that does that. The chances are that we're going to create their own database with their own authentication system. So now you have 2 databases to maintain. And let's say Courtney works with us, and then tomorrow he decides to move to another company. How are you going to manage access to the system? You have to go to these databases. You have to know exactly which databases they are. You have to remove him from those systems. With Azure AD, you have the right policy, so he gets his account removed, and he's gone. He can't access anything outside the company. I've been in companies where they never rolled their keys, and there were people that could access admin environments 2 years after they left the company, which is scary when you think about that as a standard practice, because they don't think about these things. They go like, okay, I've got my login, I've got my sign up. Another example, how are you going to do incremental back off on, how are you going to protect against brute force attacks to your system, right? All these things that you start thinking, you start piling on to what do I need to do to have a just sign in, sign out, right? I haven't talked about anything else, like resetting passwords or managing your accounts. It's a lot of work that we have 1,500 engineers working day in, day out to solve. So you can just add 4 lines of code and move on to the next task. If you want to do it, perfect. Just go and roll and spend 4 months understanding how OpenID connect and reading RFC documents. But I don't want you to be that. I want you to be successful in your job and fall in the pit of success.
I think this is, you're getting to the very important points that I think are key for any developer, both enterprise, startup, independent developer, where one, you simplify things, right? So there's experts in security, there's experts in storage and secret management that can help you kind of take that off your shoulders, do the work for you, and kind of completely abstract you out. The second thing is, and this is the fallacy where a lot of product managers, a lot of engineers fall into, is I'll build it myself. When in reality, the value prop of your product is not the login. It's not the identity. If I'm starting a startup that handles, say, helps people find remote jobs, my main value proposition is not login, right? It's not the ability to this was a stellar way for me to enter my password and username. Great. Awesome. I'll pay you now. No, because I have to focus on the value proposition of the core product. And in this case, the identity is something that I'll outsource this to the experts that know this, that know how to handle this, that know the security implications, and I'll focus on the important stuff. And I think that's the key here, is that you allow developers to focus on the important stuff and get the boring out of the way. And not to say that identity is boring, but for most developers, developers, right? Like it's just a matter of okay, I have to implement the login form and the password recovery and forgot my password and the 2FA, and it's just so much.
And getting it right. And also as a company, let's say you're a very successful startup. Now you have to scale your database as well as your the rest of the infrastructure for your users. As I said, we do 30 billion authentications, and nobody bats an eyelid. Day in, day out, you can come and log into your Teams account or your Office or whatever you use with Azure Identity or Microsoft Identity and be successful. So you can deploy all these things yourself. You can roll them out yourself. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. And everything we do is built on top of open standards like OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect. But we want you to spend as little time as possible and be successful in that and move on to the next task, because identity is item 35 in your 100 item list that you have to do as a developer. And most of the people don't really understand or know well enough to do that, or are not willing to spend the time learning. And we want people to feel comfortable that if they use our platform, they can do it well and quickly and securely, and then move on to the next task.
So
it just seems like a fundamental linchpin that you want the specialists to do it for you. You want them to be helping you, right? Like, take this off my plate, please.
Yeah, I feel like security and credential management is definitely one of those areas where, just like you should never kind of hand roll your own encryption, you should kind of not risk with things like password management when you are not the expert. Now, granted, it depends on the use case, right? If you're writing just some silly app that just is for fun, sure, whatever. But if you're serving millions of customers or hundreds of thousands of customers, tens of thousands of customers, you need a solution that scales. You need something that is actually going to support that. And you need something where you can continue iterating on customer needs, because I personally have never heard customers say, you know what, can you make the login form different? Like the product, sure, whatever, but the login form is what's bothering me.
But it's also fully customizable, right? So that's the other thing. Like if you're a company that is serious about making the identity work for your users and in a seamless way, single sign-on on your phone is such a fundamental thing for me these days, right? I never, ever have to, 90% of the apps I access on my phone are Microsoft, and it's for work or whatever. I never, ever have to put my login in. And if a web page opens, right, that I have to log in for whatever reason, if it's part of my org, I don't have to put a password. In fact, I don't even know my password. I haven't used my password because I use Hello on Windows Hello on logging in. And sometimes I use my PIN, and then I have the Authenticator app, which actually takes care of the 90% of the other cases. So for me to know my password is so rare, and nobody should know their passwords. But to know your password, especially for the domain account, it's so rare for me these days because Microsoft has got it nailed so well down. So as a developer, if you're running on whatever ecosystem, whether you're on the cloud or on-prem or some other provider, provided your users the ability to achieve what they need to do. Like if I need to check my email, I don't want to remember my password. I just want to check my email, right? If I need to go and log into the forum I used the other day with my cousin that we talk about football or whatever, then I don't want to remember the password. I remember I logged in with my Twitter account, and that's all I have to remember, and they will take care of everything else. So think about the ease of usability for your users rather than, and then for the developers, we made it so easy these days. Honestly, it's like I go to Twitch and we do streaming with other streamers, and the thing that we hear most of the time is like, I didn't know this thing existed, or I didn't know it was that simple to build something. Granted, there's some learning curve they have to have with whatever you use. As with every API and every added product, you have to have some learning curve. But the learning curve is just enough to get you to integrate and authenticate, and then you move on. That's all we want you to do.
So putting my customer's shoes on, one of the experiences that I'm a huge fan of is logging into Outlook.com with my Microsoft account. So this sounds like an advertisement, but it's not. They really nailed the experience. And I think what I like is when I type in my my email address, I get a notification in Microsoft Authenticator that says, hey, somebody's logging into your Outlook. We don't need your password, but can you confirm that it's you? Pick one of the numbers, or I can use Touch ID on my iPhone.
Yep.
As a developer now, can I implement this in my own application so that I make it frictionless for my customers with Microsoft Identity Platform?
Yeah, it's all built in. In fact, it's just a few knobs that your IT team has to switch on and switch off, and then off you go. So from an implementation perspective, all you care about is bring the right libraries and dependencies into your project, whether it's Node, Python, Ruby, .NET, whatever you use, right? Whatever language, we have the right tools for you. And even if we don't, like, let's choose something obscure, COBOL. If COBOL has an OpenID Connect library, then you can actually write a COBOL solution today that speaks to Azure AD and authenticates, or B2C. So if your IT team has said everybody has to have a single sign-on, everybody has to have multi-factor authentication. If only these people have conditional access to my app, then this will be passed down to your users without you as a developer having to worry about how that gets implemented. So you as a developer don't really have to worry about too much. You just need a client ID and a tenant ID, i.e. which Azure AD you're going to use, or B2C you're going to use, and your users just get the beauty of the end polished product that you expect to get.
I'm a big fan of pointless hackery, and so you gave me an idea for some of these pointless hack projects, which is writing a OpenID library in COBOL. So I'll add it to my list for next year, and I'll see how far can I get. Right?
I'll build it with us, man.
I'll come back to you and say, remember when you said that I can use Microsoft Identity with COBOL? Well, do I have something for you in store?
Make sure you search first, because I'm pretty sure that somebody has already solved the problem.
I would not be surprised if it exists, honestly. Like, I think in the past year, we've seen, stories for VS Code. We've seen like all these projects that are like, why? But it exists. So I would not be surprised. Now, from the perspective of kind of identity, what are some things that you learned in your career working with the identity team that you would not have learned anywhere else? Like, I'm generally curious because I think that brings a whole new perspective to typical product manager, because you're a product manager. And in this case, kind of, what's your take on that? What are the things that you've learned in identity that would be probably harder to learn somewhere else?
I have to say that the learning curve for us was much bigger than the actual consumer developer person, because I have to understand protocols. Like, I have to understand what OpenID Connect is, what the flow looks like, and all the different flows, like code flow or credential flow or authentication flow, all the things that are used to implement the things that you don't really see behind the scenes. And I haven't even scratched the surface in the 6 months I've been with the team, or 7 months I've been with the team. There's so much to learn, but for me to be able to do my job well, I need to understand quite a few more things than the average identity developer, if you want to call that, or people that consume that service need to know. So, seeing how much complexity there is behind the scenes, and our org is very transparent. There are a lot of emails that go out every single day about a new feature, a new implementation. That's very important. I think as the identity org, but also as Microsoft, I've seen a massive shift in how we prioritize customer feedback and customer needs over what we build. So it's not what the PM thinks it's important, it's what the customer thinks it's important. And validating that with the customer or customers before we go and build something, it's also something that I've seen the org doing very, very well. And we're learning, right? We're not perfect. We're learning. There's a lot of stuff that we can still improve: documentation, product experience, user experience, UI design. But I think as an org, we are getting better at building these things. And then we're also getting better about talking about these things. So I don't know if you've noticed, but I haven't talked about tokens once today, right? I haven't talked about ID tokens or access tokens or anything like that, because I don't want you to know about these things. I want you to know about how easy we make it to implement and integrate with our solution, and making that story sound right. Because, these products are super complex and people are building some very complex stuff, but I don't want you to know about the 95% you're not going to use in your app. If you're only building a forum for your friends, then it's usually sign in, sign out, and maybe managing your profile. And that's all built into the product. Now you can do some super complex things, but if the time comes to that, you can reach out to us and we'll help you out. So getting the story right, getting the product right is things I've learned, because it's the first time I'm actually working with a product team rather than working with customers directly in solving problems. So my role is to tell the story well. So hopefully I've done a good job in.
You're doing a fantastic job. I like, this whole point of the show is for us to learn. So with that, it seems like you mentioned that you're active on Twitter. If customers or any of our listeners want to learn more about identity, they want to learn more about the things that you do, where do they go? Where should they go?
Well, they can definitely follow me on Twitter or reach out to me on Twitter. You don't have to follow me to speak to me, but feel free to reach out at Christos Matskas. My Twitter handle is not as inventive, I would say. So naming things is hard, so I went with my name.
Good names are taken, right? Like there's nothing that you can get on Twitter that is like one of those. I actually, we had our guest not too long ago, Jin Yang, and he has a 3-letter Twitter handle.
Wow. JZY. Yep.
Yeah, that's one of those things where you're like, this is the OG Twitter handle that you want to have back in the day. So now I'm always on the lookout for like, what is the next Twitter that's coming up so I can register my name?
Yeah. My full name, you'll find me there. And then, we're on Discord. You can reach out to me. I'll tell you all the details. And if you want to see us do this thing live, twitch.tv/425 show. Then we are there twice a week minimum, talking about identity. You can come and ask us questions live. Like, people will ask random things. So as long as we can answer them and they're in the knowledge base that we have around the world, then feel free to reach out to us anytime, and we would love to help you, or point you to the right direction at least.
Excellent. Well, Christos, thank you so much for being on the show, and we hope to talk to you sometime soon. We'll have to invite you for another episode where you could actually talk about tokens, because I'm curious now.
No. First, let's do the Cabal with OpenID Connect.
Oh, right. Yes. So, okay, now that it's my commitments, sure. All right. Well, thanks so much for being on the show. Till next time.
Thank you for having me. Thank you both.